One of the most well-known facts about Jesus is his death, and specifically how he died, that he died on a cross. If someone came to you and said, "Why did Jesus die?" what would you say? If this circle represents Jesus' life, about 33 years, John's gospel, which is considered by some to be a biography, John's gospel is only about 10% of Jesus' life. Only the last 3 years does John talk about Jesus, his public ministry. Now, if this circle represents John's gospel, then about 1/4 of that gospel is dedicated to the last hours of Jesus' death and his death on the cross. In the previous segment, we read chapter 19, verses 16 through 37. And there were a number of unusual details in John's description of Jesus' crucifixion. Let me go over some of those, and I want you to think about why in the world would John include the details that he included. First, he starts off by telling us that Pilate had placed a sign over Jesus on the cross that read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," and that the Jewish leaders objected to that and wanted it changed to, "He claimed to be the King of the Jews." But then rather prophetically, as John records it for us, Pilate's response is to say, what he has written, and it remains. The second thing John tells us about is how the soldiers that crucified Jesus stole his clothes. They divided them amongst the 4 of them, but the robe that Jesus was wearing, which John says was seamless, they decided that they wouldn't tear it into 4 pieces and ruin it. Instead, they would throw dice for it, and the winner then would just get the robe. Again, a rather unusual detail that John includes in his description of Jesus' crucifixion. The third thing he tells us is that there were 3 women watching this, each of them named Mary, interestingly. And one of them, Jesus' mother, who was there when he saw her, entrusts her into the care of John, the gospel writer, into John's care. The fourth thing that John records for us is that somewhere near the end of his life, Jesus said that he was thirsty. And then he gives us a little bit of unusual detail about that and says that some who were there, there was a jar of sour wine, and someone had taken a sponge and soaked it in the sour wine, put it on a hyssop branch, and held it up to Jesus, who then took a drink. It seems like then, immediately following, Jesus then utters his last words, which John tells us are, "It is finished." And then lastly in his description, John tells us about how, it being the day of preparation, the Jewish leaders didn't want these bodies to remain on the cross, and so they appealed to Pilate to have the legs of the crucified broken. When someone was being crucified, in order for them to breathe, it was necessary for them to use their legs and push up in order to take a breath. So if they wanted to hasten the death of the crucified person by breaking their legs, they would then not be able to push up in order to take a breath, and they would suffocate. John tells us that 2 of the people who were crucified with Jesus, one on each side, criminals, their legs were broken, but when they came to Jesus, he appeared to be dead already, so that they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and we're told that there was a flow of both blood and water as a result of being speared. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty as to when John wrote his gospel, the dating of that letter, or that gospel. It could be as early as around 55 AD to as late as 85 AD, which means that John was writing his gospel at the earliest over 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion, to as many as 50 years after Jesus' crucifixion. My point is, isn't it unusual that John would include, he's writing 20 to 50 years later, the details that he included? They seem rather obscure, and as such, you'd think in 20 to 50 years you would forget about them. But instead, he includes them. The other thing is that normally with the perspective of time, something that might at one point, or when something initially happens, might seem very important and significant. With the perspective of time, then there's the realization that those things were not significant. But that didn't happen with John. After 20 or 50 years of time perspective, the details that John decides to give us did not diminish in significance, but in fact became even more significant. And John seems very intentional in his description of Jesus' death and what he included. Now, Jesus' disciples had a very strong view of what they expected in God's Messiah. They were like many other Jews who expected that God's Messiah would come and establish an earthly kingdom. And they believed that Jesus was God's Messiah and that was what he was going to do. He was going to establish an earthly kingdom. As you read the Gospels, in particular Mark's Gospel, Mark tells us that during the training of his 12 disciples, on 3 different occasions, Jesus, realizing that they had these wrong ideas about God's Messiah and the establishing of a kingdom, 3 different times, Jesus told his disciples, or tried to warn them, that their understanding was wrong and misguided, and give them a right understanding as to what was going to happen, what God's Messiah looked like. Maybe you remember there's one of these times that Jesus was telling his disciples what in fact was going to happen to him since he was God's Messiah. He said this to them: "The Messiah must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." In one of those times, Peter responds to Jesus and objects vehemently and says to him, that will never happen to you, Lord. We'll never let that happen to you. And Jesus, rather surprisingly and seemingly rather harshly, says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. So they had to the very end, this misconception about Jesus and about God's Messiah. They had left everything for Jesus. And when everything collapsed for them, when Jesus was crucified, they were devastated. Everything had come to an end. Yes, Jesus was a great prophet, teacher, but he was not God's Messiah. All that they had thought he had promised to them, that all the things that they had left for him, as he said, anyone who has given up house or brothers or sisters or mother or father, children or property for my sake and for the good news will receive now in return 100 times as many houses, brothers, sisters, and children. They expected that. And now not only was that going to come true, but in fact they were going to have to fear for their lives. even after the resurrection, even after some of the disciples and Jesus' followers had found the empty tomb. The angels had told them that just as Jesus said, that he had been raised from the dead, still they did not believe. In Luke's gospel, he tells us that on the third day, after Jesus had been crucified, and after Jesus had risen from the dead, two of his followers, not one of his 11 disciples, now that Judas was gone, two of his followers were returning to their hometown of Emmaus. One of them was Clopas, whose wife is mentioned in John's gospel as being at the foot of the cross. One of the two is Clopas, and they were walking along the road to Emmaus, returning to their home, and they were discussing the events, all the things that had happened. Of course, they were perplexed, and as I said earlier, they were devastated. They just didn't know how to respond. Their world had collapsed. And Jesus appears to these two, obviously as a man, and the text tells us that they were blinded. They were blinded so that they didn't recognize that it was Jesus. And so this man joins them as they walk along on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus overhears what they're talking about and asks them what it is that they're discussing. This is their response. We're talking about the things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth, they said. He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. Then Jesus said to them, that is to the two he's walking with, "You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory?" Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. These followers, Jesus' disciples, they believed what? They believed that he was a prophet who did powerful miracles, who was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. Just as Dr. Rufus had said in his as Dr. Fears had said in his lecture, they had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel, but they were sure that was not going to happen and that he was not the Messiah. But they were wrong. They were wrong. It was only when they would give up their own expectations, their own beliefs about God's Messiah, give up those prejudices that blinded them to the truth, that they could really see God's Messiah. 3 times, at least 3 times, long before Jesus was crucified, Jesus tried to show them the scriptures that talked about God's Messiah and how he would die, that was God's intention. That was not a negation of Jesus' identity as the Messiah, but it was a confirmation of his identity. Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So why did John record what he did? Why did Jesus' death figure so prominently in his gospel, why did he include the obscure, seemingly obscure details he did? Because Jesus is not just a prophet, a teacher, the founder of a religion, or a martyr, just like many others. He included those things because it showed that Jesus fulfilled what was written in the scripture. Jesus is God's Messiah. And Jesus said, only foolish people don't see it. John, in chapter 20, tells us at the end of his gospel the reason why he wrote his gospel and the reason why he focuses on Jesus' death and includes the details that he did. These are written, he says, so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. So why did Jesus die? Because he had to, according to the scriptures, because he's God's Messiah.